Close your eyes, dear listener. Let the noise of the day melt away. Allow each breath to slow, like a soft breeze drifting through ancient ruins. Tonight, we set sail to the great train robbery of 1963. The English countryside was wrapped in a blanket of quiet that August night in 1963. Not the sharp silence of winter, when frost holds its breath and the air feels brittle, but the soft, drowsy stillness of late summer, warm, fragrant, and slow. Somewhere beyond the hedgerows, an owl called once, twice, then fell silent, its wings brushing the darkness as it glided away. The fields stretched out in shades of silver and charcoal, the moon hidden behind drifting clouds that dimmed and brightened with each slow passing. A faint mist clung low to the ground, swirling lazily in the hollows, blurring the shapes of sheep and the crumbling stones of old fences. It was a night when time seemed to loosen its grip, when the world dozed under the gentle rhythm of crickets and the occasional rustle in the grass. And then, far off, beyond the sleeping farms and quiet villages, a sound rose on the wind. Distant at first, like a heartbeat buried deep in the earth. It was the steady, unhurried chug of an engine, the kind that spoke of weight and distance, of iron and power. The Glasgow-London Royal Mail train, sliding through the night along its steel veins. To most, it was nothing unusual. The train ran like clockwork, its passage as predictable as the moon's rise. But in the village of Ledburn, there were those, mostly the older folk, who leaned a little closer to their hearth fires on nights like this and muttered about the old story. They called it the Midnight Coach. The tale was as old as the rails themselves, though no one could say exactly when it began. Some said it was first told by navvies, the rough-handed men who had carved the tracks through hill and field in the 1800s. Others swore it came from even earlier, from the days when the Roman road cut across this land, when strange lights and phantom carts were seen on misty nights. The legend was simple, but unsettling. On certain nights, always quiet ones, always under a drifting moon, a train would appear on the line, silent and black as coal, with no light in its windows. It would glide past without a sound, its carriages shrouded in shadow. Those who saw it claimed that within its dark compartments sat figures, some still as statues, some moving slowly, their faces pale and unreadable. It was said that the midnight coach came as a warning, that somewhere along its route before dawn, a great misfortune would take place. Most dismissed it as a fireside story, something to make the younger ones sit closer and the older ones feel they still knew secrets the modern world had forgotten. But there were those who swore it had appeared the night before a mine collapse near Aylesbury in 1902. Others said it had been seen just hours before a mail coach derailed in 38. And now, the train from Glasgow was due to pass within the hour, its driver unaware of the whispers his journey stirred in the dark. At Brigo Bridge, the steel rails gleamed faintly in the starlight. The bridge itself nothing grand, just a short, arched crossing over a country road, the kind you might pass without notice on any day but this. Below, the road lay empty, its pale gravel faintly aglow. A hare darted across, ears flat, and vanished into the tall grass. Further up the track,
A small red light blinked in the distance, the signal lamp swaying gently in the night air. It glowed as steady as a watchman's eye. And yet, somewhere in that stillness, the night began to lean forward. A shift, so subtle it could almost be missed. The wind seemed to pause. The crickets fell quiet. And from the darkness, the rails began to hum. In a cottage half a mile away, a farmer's wife sat by her kitchen window, her hands resting idle on a folded apron. She had been waiting for her husband to return from checking the sheep, but now her gaze was caught by the glimmer of the track in the distance. She thought she saw a shape there, not the bright, welcoming front of the mail train, but something darker. A shadow that moved with purpose, yet made no sound at all. She blinked, and it was gone. The hum faded. Somewhere, the owl called again. She told herself it was nothing, just the tricks of a long day and a tired mind. But at that very moment, many miles to the north, a group of men were already in motion. They were not dressed like robbers from the stories. No masks, no pistols gleaming in the moonlight. Their clothes were ordinary, their steps careful. But in their minds, a plan was unfolding. A plan that would turn this warm summer night into one of the most famous in British history. And if you had been there, hidden in the hedgerows as they passed, you might have noticed something else. The way one of the men kept glancing over his shoulder. The way another touched the side of his neck as though he felt the faint breath of a passing train that was not there. For history tells us the great train robbery was the work of daring and precision, but the countryside, and those who have listened to it long enough, whisper another tale. That before the robbers took the gold, before the train was stopped, the midnight coach passed through, and that it was not empty. The day before the robbery, the countryside had been restless in ways only the old ones noticed. The air was too still for August, the clouds moving too quickly across the sky without any real wind to carry them. The rooks had flown in uneven circles above the hedgerows, their calls sharp and impatient. And in more than one farmhouse, curtains twitched as people peered out toward the railway, not entirely sure what they were looking for, but certain something was coming. In the village of Cheddington, the postmaster, a wiry man named Harold Penn, locked the front door of the little sorting office and paused before stepping out into the fading afternoon light. His fingers tapped nervously against the iron key in his hand. The Royal Mail train was due that night, as it always was, carrying sacks heavy with banknotes bound for London. That was no secret. It had been happening for decades.
But Harold's grandfather had once told him a strange thing. The money on the train ain't the only thing the countryside watches, lad. Sometimes the rails carry more than letters and gold. Sometimes they carry shadows. He'd been a boy when he heard it, and like most boys, he'd thought it was a fine, spooky yarn. Yet here he was, 40 years later, still glancing at the horizon each time the train was due. Across the fields, in a sagging farmhouse, an old woman named Elsie had been tending her garden when she noticed the rabbits behaving oddly. They were not feeding in the open grass as usual. Instead, they huddled close to the hedgerows, their noses twitching, ears cocked toward the track. She straightened slowly, her knees complaining with the effort, and shaded her eyes with a dirt-streaked hand. The line lay a good quarter-mile away, but she could see it clearly in the afternoon light. And for a heartbeat, just one, she thought she saw a train already there.
Not the 15-carriage Royal Mail with its red-painted sides and bright headlamps. This one was black, the windows blank, its outlines strange and somehow older. It did not seem to move with the rattle and sway she knew from years of watching the line. It slid, smooth and silent, like a shadow cast by something too far away to touch. She blinked, and the track was empty again. The breeze moved through the hawthorn, and the rabbits crept back to nibbling at the grass. Elsie made the sign of the cross, though she had not set foot in the church for years.
By nightfall, the men who would make history were gathering. Some arrived in battered lorries, others in quiet, nondescript vans. They spoke little, moving with the quiet confidence of those who had rehearsed their parts until they could have walked them in their sleep. There was no bravado, no loud talk of what they would do once the job was over. Just the soft clink of tools, the muted thud of boots on packed earth, and the occasional murmur passed from one to another. But among them was a man called Wilson, a sharp-eyed fellow with a smile that could charm and unsettle in equal measure. He was no believer in old wives' tales, and yet, as he checked the final map by the light of a shaded torch, he thought he saw something move in the darkness beyond the hedge. Not a man, not an animal, just a shape, sliding between the moonlit gaps, as if keeping pace with him. When he turned his head to look straight at it, it was gone. "You all right?" one of the others asked quietly. "Fine," Wilson said, folding the map. But his voice was a little too quick, a little too tight. Meanwhile, in a cottage 2 miles away, a boy of 9 was woken from a deep sleep by the sound of a train. Nothing unusual in that. He'd grown up with the rhythm of the midnight service rolling through his dreams. But this was different. The sound was wrong. Too soft. Too slow. He padded barefoot to the window, the floorboards cool under his feet. And there it was. The midnight coach. Black. Endless. Its carriages without light. Its engine giving off no steam. As it passed, he could have sworn he saw a face in one of the windows. Not a face like his father's or the men at the station. Something thinner, paler. Its eyes seemed to catch the moonlight and hold it, like coins that had been buried in the earth for too long. The boy stepped back, his breath loud in his ears. When he looked again, the track was empty. The night had settled thick over the Buckinghamshire countryside, the kind of darkness that seemed to absorb sound. Somewhere in the hedgerows, an owl called once and then fell silent, as though even it sensed that the air tonight belonged to something else. It was August 8th, 1963. The Royal Mail train, traveling from Glasgow to London, carried over £2.6 million in banknotes, the equivalent of many lifetimes of ordinary work. But to the 13 men who waited in the shadows, the figure was less important than the plan. A plan that had been polished until it gleamed. At Leighton Buzzard Station, the train passed as usual, its headlamp cutting through the warm night air. On board, the postal workers sorted through the money bags, the sound of shuffling paper and clinking coins mixing with the hum of the rails. They were tired, but used to the rhythm, a night's work for a secure wage. None of them knew that less than an hour ahead, the track itself would betray them. Near the small signal box at Sears Crossing, the gang's first move was already in place. A red light burned against the night, but not because the signalman had set it. The real signal was dark. The red was an illusion, rigged by careful, deliberate hands hours before. The driver, Jack Mills, seeing the warning, eased the train to a halt. Steam hissed softly, drifting over the quiet fields. Somewhere beyond the hedgerow, a fox barked once. Or perhaps it wasn't a fox. One of the robbers, a man known as Reynolds, thought it sounded almost like a voice calling his name. When he glanced into the darkness, there was nothing there but the faint shimmer of moonlight on the rails. Still, a small knot formed in his stomach. The gang moved quickly. They boarded the engine, overpowered Mills and his second man, David Whitby. The plan had been to take control without serious harm, but Mills resisted, and in the struggle, a cosh struck his head. The moment was ugly, abrupt, and it seemed to pull something heavier into the night air. A feeling as if the countryside itself had just taken notice. Whitby, his hands bound, kept glancing toward the west, where the fields met the dark line of trees. Later, he would tell police that he thought he saw lantern lights there. Not torches, lanterns, swinging slowly, evenly, the way old railway watchmen used to signal. Except there hadn't been railway watchmen on this stretch for decades. Once the engine was moved forward to a bridge at Bredigo, the rest of the gang fell into place. Sacks of banknotes were hauled from the second carriage, their weight pulling at arms and backs. The work was quick, methodical. They had only minutes before the alarm would spread. But as the money changed hands in the shadow under the bridge, one of the younger men, Buster, froze. Just beyond the dim cone of light from their own lamps, another train was passing on the parallel track. At least, that's what he thought at first. Its windows were lit, but the light was wrong. Not the bright white of electric bulbs, but a sickly, flickering glow. Figures moved inside, their shapes blurred as if the glass itself were shifting. The train made no sound. He blinked, and the track was empty. The others, busy with the sacks, didn't notice. Or maybe they did, but decided to say nothing. By the time the robbers vanished into the countryside with their haul, the Royal Mail train sat silent and half-abandoned, steam curling into the night. Behind it, the signal lamp still glowed red, though no one had touched it since the job began. And far off, in the dark line of the trees, the faint gleam of lanterns moved away as if escorting something that could not be seen. By morning, the headlines were already writing themselves. The crime of the century screamed from the front page of every paper, black ink pressed into millions of sheets that rustled in cafes, pubs, and kitchens across Britain. People whispered the details as if passing a spell. 13 men, a stopped train, millions in cash, and a getaway so clean it seemed almost like fiction. The police swarmed Buckinghamshire. Uniformed constables combed the hedgerows, searching for footprints, scraps of rope, anything left behind. Detectives with heavy coats and heavier eyes interviewed farmers, signalmen, and railway staff. But for every piece of evidence they found, there were other details that made less sense. One farmer claimed that just after midnight, he saw an older engine pass along the disused track near his land. Not the Royal Mail train, something much older, with a black funnel and a plume of pale smoke. It moved slowly, almost deliberately, and made no sound but the faintest chuff. When the police checked, they found no tracks there at all. The line had been torn up years earlier. At the gang's safe house, an old farmhouse called Leatherslade, the money was divided into neat bundles. The men were tired but elated, though a few kept glancing at the windows as if expecting to see someone outside. One of them, Roger Cordry, later swore that during the night he heard the rhythmic clatter of a train passing right by the house. The nearest rail line was miles away. It was weeks before the police began to close in. Tips were followed, names gathered, the safe house was found, and with it, fingerprints, a fatal mistake. The gang began to scatter, some caught quickly, others slipping into years of hiding. But even those who escaped the law found it harder to escape something else.
In 1964, Charlie Wilson, one of the robbers, was imprisoned in Winson Green Prison. Guards on night duty began to report odd disturbances in the wing where he was kept. Footsteps echoing on empty corridors, a faint smell of coal smoke. Once, a guard swore he saw the beam of a lantern sliding along the wall outside Wilson's cell. When he checked, there was no one there. Wilson himself, though he laughed at such things in the day, began to have dreams. In them, he stood beside the Royal Mail train again, but instead of his fellow gang members, the carriages were filled with shadowy passengers. Their faces were pale, eyes like smudges of coal, and they stared at him without speaking. When he woke, he could still feel the sway of the train under his feet. Ronnie Biggs, who famously escaped from prison and fled to Brazil, told a different kind of story years later in an interview. He claimed that whenever he returned to England in secret, even for short visits, he would hear a train whistle at night, even if he was far from any railway. And once, staying in a quiet countryside inn, he saw from his window a plume of smoke drifting across the moonlit field. When he looked again, it was gone, but the room smelled faintly of old paper money and damp steel. Historians like to keep the story of the Great Train Robbery clean, factual, measurable. The arrests, the trials, the sentences. But in villages along the old line, the older locals still tell other tales. Of seeing a silent steam train at night, lit by lanterns instead of electric light. Of shadowed figures in postal uniforms standing in the fields as if guarding something only they can see. And of a belief that the 1963 robbers did not just steal money, they woke something that had been asleep along the rails for decades. They say the railway remembers, and it does not forgive.
The stretch of track between Glasgow and London had always carried whispers. Before 1963, before diesel and electric, before the Royal Mail ran with the precision of clockwork, there were already stories. Old railwaymen would share them in the mess rooms over mugs of tea, never writing them down, never speaking too loudly, because it was bad luck to tell the tales when the wind was high. They said the line had a ghost train. Not the usual kind, no pale engine screaming out of nowhere, no headless driver on the footplate. This one, they claimed, only appeared when something was about to go terribly wrong. A black steam locomotive, its paint dull and weathered, the number plate so worn it was unreadable. It made no sound except for a slow, deliberate chuff, and its headlamp gave off a sickly yellow glow. Some said they'd seen it in the moments before a rail accident. Others swore it appeared before certain robberies or crimes, always a sign that something was about to be taken and someone was about to pay. When the Great Train Robbery happened, some of the older signalmen weren't surprised. One man, Tom Blackwood, told a local paper, before the interview was quietly pulled, that on the night of the robbery, just past midnight, he saw the ghost train. It came down the slow line, right as we were expecting the Royal Mail. No noise, Just smoke and that damned yellow lamp. I knew then something was coming. He died 2 years later in what the papers called a freak accident involving a railway maintenance cart.
Folklorists who've studied the case point out that the robbery site in Buckinghamshire lies close to a much older pathway, a Roman road that once linked small forts and posting stations. Some believe the ghost train is just the newest skin worn by something older, a spirit of the road itself, a guardian or a thief, depending on who passes. There's even a legend that one of the robbers, when the money was being counted at Leatherslade Farm, found an envelope that didn't belong with the rest. Inside were ancient Roman coins, green with age, stamped with the face of an emperor long forgotten. The others laughed, saying it was just a collector's piece, maybe stolen from the post along with the cash. But that robber, unnamed in the records, supposedly vanished before the year's end. Some say he was never caught because he never left the railway's shadow. Today, railway enthusiasts sometimes camp along the disused parts of the old line, hoping to spot the ghost train. They bring cameras, audio recorders, EMF meters. Most see nothing, but a few return with strange photographs, a faint plume of smoke where no train runs, a streak of yellow.
Night had fallen over the English countryside, and the old rails lay silent, stretching through fields silvered by moonlight. No trains ran at this hour, not since the robbery. Yet some said if you stood by the track on a still night, you could hear the faint hum of an approaching engine long before any light appeared. It was in the weeks after the heist that stories began to drift into the papers, always printed in the smallest columns, as if the editors didn't know whether to mock or believe them. A farmhand near Leighton Buzzard swore he saw a man walking the line in the middle of the night, tall, gaunt, wearing a tattered railway coat that fluttered in the wind. When the farmhand called out, the man turned his head, and where his eyes should have been, there was nothing but deep black hollows. The next morning, the farmhand found an old railway lantern on his doorstep, lit, but without oil. The police dismissed such tales, but the robbers whispered about it among themselves. Charlie Wilson, the so-called treasurer of the gang, told his mates in hushed tones that the man in the coat was the spirit of a signalman killed in the war, a man who had once worked that very stretch of track and had been buried in an unmarked grave nearby. And now, so the story went, he wandered at night, searching for trains to guide or to stop. It might have stayed just a fireside rumor, except that one of the gang, a quiet fellow named Jimmy White, vanished. Jimmy had taken his share of the loot and gone into hiding, laying low in a small rented cottage far from the city. But one rainy evening, the local landlord saw him leave, carrying a railway lantern, the old-fashioned kind, its brass casing dulled with age. He never came back. His cottage stood empty for weeks before the police searched it. Inside, they found most of his belongings untouched, but the bed was neatly made, the fire cold, and on the kitchen table lay a folded scrap of paper. It read, in cramped handwriting, "The man in the coat knows the way." The police kept it out of the official reports.
The great train robbery was supposed to be the perfect crime. In the early days after the heist, the newspapers printed the sum again and again. £2.6 million in banknotes, most of them so fresh they still carried the faint scent of the printing press. The public was fascinated. The police were humiliated. And the robbers, scattered across safe houses and back roads, waited for the heat to die down. But then something strange began to happen. It started in a small post office in Buckinghamshire. A clerk arriving for the morning shift found a brown canvas sack sitting neatly in front of the door. Inside, bundles of banknotes, the exact kind stolen from the Royal Mail train. No note, no footprints in the frost, no explanation. Within weeks, more of the stolen money began to surface, always in odd places. A fishing hut by the River Ouse, the loft of an abandoned barn, wrapped in oilcloth and tucked beneath the altar of a country church that had been locked for years. The amounts were never large, a few £100 here, 1,000 there, but they were always clean, dry, and tied with twine. And stranger still, in every bundle was a single old railway ticket, punched and faded with age, as if it had been carried for decades in someone's coat pocket. The police assumed it was a guilty gang member trying to quietly return the loot, but the robbers thought otherwise. Buster Edwards, one of the more superstitious in the group, swore it was the man in the tattered coat, the ghostly signalman taking the money back to its rightful place, one piece at a time. "He's got the map in his head," Buster told them over pints in a backroom pub. "Knows every mile of track, every station that ever was. Maybe he's just walking it home." Charlie Wilson laughed it off, but even he started keeping the curtains drawn at night. Some mornings he claimed he'd wake to find faint prints in the dew outside his window. Prints shaped not like boots, but like the square, flat soles of an old railwayman's shoes. By the end of the year, nearly £20,000 of the stolen money had walked home in this fashion. And each time it did, another man from the crew would grow restless, pack up and vanish. Some to Spain, others to South America. But a few, like Jimmy White before them, disappeared without trace. The myth was beginning to wrap itself around the truth like ivy. And somewhere out there, on the old iron rails, the signalman still walked. It was November 1964. The kind of damp English autumn where the mist clung to hedgerows and never quite lifted from the fields. Ronald Buster Edwards had been drinking more than usual, his nerves shot from months of jumpy nights and strange coincidences. He'd begun hearing a sound outside his flat, not footsteps exactly, but the soft tap-tap of something metallic, like a lantern swinging and bumping against a thigh. On the third night, he decided to follow it. The noise led him down to the railway cutting, the tracks slick with fog and rain. There, just ahead, was the figure, the tattered coat, the flat railwayman's shoes, and in his hand a green lantern that glowed like a ghost light. The man walked steadily, as though keeping to an invisible timetable. Buster kept his distance, the mist swallowing sound, until they came to a disused siding where weeds had swallowed the sleepers. The figure stopped, knelt, and began digging in the earth with bare hands. Buster crouched low, his breath clouding in the lantern's dim glow. After a few minutes, the man pulled something out, a cloth-wrapped bundle. He set it on the ground, stood, and without turning said in a voice that was both distant and close, "Some things belong to the rails, lad, and some men too." The signalmen began walking again, but not along the tracks, straight into the fog. And the fog seemed to take him, folding in until there was nothing there. When Buster crept forward and unwrapped the bundle, he found it full of banknotes, crisp, clean, but damp with a faint smell of engine smoke and hot iron. On top was an old railway ticket, punched and dated 1893. Buster didn't sleep that night. By morning, he decided to put the bundle in the post to Scotland Yard anonymously. He told no one, not even his wife, what had happened. But from that day forward, whenever he walked past a siding, he found himself glancing into the mist, listening for that faint tap-tap. The myth of the signalman had become real to him. And Buster suspected, though he would never say it aloud, that one day the man in the coat might come walking for him.
Tommy Wisby had always laughed at the ghost stories. He was a hard man, all sharp angles and sharper tongue, the sort who believed in nothing but his own wits and fists. Even after the robbery, when whispers of the Lantern Man started passing through prison cells and pubs, Tommy dismissed them as drunken fancy. But in the winter of '65, things began to change. He'd been hiding in a small cottage outside Bedford, its back door opening straight onto an abandoned railway line. Every night he'd sit with the curtains drawn, smoking by the glow of a single lamp, waiting for the sound of a police knock that never came. Then one night, a rhythmic clang began drifting through the frosted air. It wasn't the sound of boots or cars, but something older, the heavy thunk of an iron coupling, over and over, as though an invisible train were being assembled in the dark. Tommy grabbed his torch and stepped outside. The air was so cold it felt like glass against his teeth. The disused track stretched away into moonlit mist, and there, about 50 yards down, was a shadow that didn't move with the rest. The figure stood in the middle of the line, tall and thin, with a long coat that seemed to sway though there was no wind. In one hand it held a railway lantern, in the other what looked like a signal flag, limp in the still night. Tommy called out. No answer. He stepped closer. The lantern light wavered, spilling over rails that shone wet though no rain had fallen. The figure raised the flag slowly, then let it drop. Somewhere far off, a train whistle shrieked, long, mournful, and impossibly loud for an abandoned line. The figure spoke. All passengers aboard. Last stop west of the sun. Tommy felt the ground tremble under his boots. A wind swept along the track, hot and oily like the breath of a steam engine. The noise grew, the roar of wheels on iron, the hiss of brakes, but nothing appeared. The air shimmered, and for a moment he thought he saw it, a black train with no lights, just shadows in its windows. When he blinked, it was gone, the figure too. By morning, Tommy packed what he could carry and left the cottage without telling the owner. Years later, when he finally spoke of it to another ex-robber, he ended the tale the same way every time. You can run from the police, mate, but you can't run from the keeper of the tracks. By the autumn of 1974, Bruce Reynolds had been living under so many names that even he sometimes forgot which one he was using. The once dashing mastermind of the great train robbery was older now. The sharp edges of his face worn down by years on the run, the thrill replaced by a kind of restless fatigue. He'd settled in a rented villa on the southern coast of Spain, its windows looking out over the endless shimmer of the Mediterranean. It was quiet there. Too quiet. Every night, Bruce would sit on the terrace with a glass of red wine, telling himself he'd finally outrun the past. Then the dreams began. They always started the same way, with him standing on a platform he didn't recognize. It was night, but the air was thick with a red-tinged fog. Somewhere beyond it, a train waited, its outline vast but indistinct, as though it were carved from shadow. The platform clock read 03:17, and though no one else was visible,
Bruce could hear the faint murmur of voices, low, urgent, like gamblers whispering over a crooked hand of cards. On the fourth night, the dream changed. The voices fell silent. A single figure stepped from the fog. Tall, coat buttoned to the chin, face hidden under the brim of a railwayman's cap. A lantern swung from his hand, casting circles of dull red light. "Mr. Reynolds, your ticket, please." Bruce reached into his coat and found one there. Old, worn, edges curling as though it had been in his pocket for decades. The destination was printed in letters he couldn't read, though part of him understood it without needing translation. "I'm not ready," Bruce said. The man tilted his head, almost in pity. "No one ever is." The sound came then, the rumble of wheels, the hiss of unseen brakes, the distant cry of a whistle. The train slid into view, black as coal dust, its windows glowing faintly like embers in the dark. Inside, silhouettes sat perfectly still, their faces turned toward the glass, though none had eyes. The conductor stepped aside. Bruce felt the pull, not of force, but of inevitability. He stepped toward the carriage door, his hand brushing the cold metal handle. That was when he woke. The villa was dark, the only sound the faint crash of waves. But from far inland, carried on the wind, came the echo of a train whistle. 3 long notes, low, mournful, calling.
In the years after Bruce Reynolds' dream on the Spanish coast, the other men from that fateful night in 1963 began to speak, quietly, cautiously, of their own strange encounters. It always began the same way. A sound where there should be none. The low, distant moan of a steam whistle on a night when no trains ran. Charlie Wilson, living in exile in Canada, heard it while walking home from a pub in the snow. Buster Edwards swore it echoed through the flower market in Vauxhall at dawn, mingling with the smell of wet stems in diesel trucks. Even those who'd sworn off contact with the others whispered to old friends in hushed voices, "It's followed me. It knows my name." Some said the train was the Night Express, a locomotive that had once run through the English countryside in the 19th century before vanishing without a trace in a blizzard. Others claimed it was older still, a myth from the earliest days of the railways, a line that connected not towns, but the living to the dead. A train that always arrived at 3:17 for passengers who had debts left unpaid. By 1978, the whispers grew darker. Tommy Wisby, one of the gang's strongmen, was found sitting on a bench outside King's Cross Station long after the last train had gone. When asked by police what he was doing, he simply said, "Waiting for my connection," and smiled like a man already halfway gone. The legends claimed that once you heard the whistle 3 times in a row, your journey had begun. No ticket could be refused, no station avoided. The train would come, and you would board, and when the doors closed behind you, it would not be seen again until the next name was called. One rainy night in 1983, a reporter chasing the scattered survivors of the great train robbery swore she saw it. From the window of a late-night cab along the A413, the same road near Ledburn where the real robbery had taken place, she glimpsed a black engine sliding silently down a line that no longer existed. Inside the lit carriages, Men in 1960s suits sat with heads bowed over playing cards, untouched pints, and folded newspapers. One of them, she insisted, looked directly at her as she passed. She recognized him from an old wanted poster. He raised his hand in a small, slow wave. And then, in a blink, the train was gone.
Spain, 1993. Bruce Reynolds had grown older, his once dark hair silvering at the edges, the sharp lines of his face softened by time. The world had moved on. The British Rail of his youth was gone. The men he once led scattered to prisons, graves, and quiet retirements. Yet the feeling had never left him. That faint hum beneath the skin, the echo of a whistle where no line remained. It was the night of August 7th when it came for him. The streets of Torremolinos were empty, save for the soft hiss of the sea. Bruce had been unable to sleep, pacing the balcony of his small flat when the air changed, as if the tide had pulled back far beyond the horizon. Then, from somewhere deep and impossible, came the sound. One long, low note, then another, and another. 3. When he stepped into the street, the world had taken on a strange silver light, as though moonlight had replaced the sun. At the corner, where there should have been a cafe, there stood a station. Not of this era, wrought iron lamps, oak benches, a great clock ticking without sound. The platform was empty except for a single black locomotive, its brass fixtures glinting, steam curling softly into the air. Painted in faded letters along its side, "The Night Express." The conductor, tall, lean, with eyes like polished coal, tipped his cap. "Evening, Mr. Reynolds. Been expecting you." Bruce almost laughed. "What line is this?" The man's smile was thin. "The last one you'll ever need." Inside, the carriages were warm and dimly lit, filled with the soft murmur of voices. Men he knew, some dead for decades, sat in small clusters, playing cards, sipping tea, nodding in quiet recognition. Charlie Wilson, Ronnie Biggs, Buster Edwards, all exactly as they had been in their prime. Bruce took a seat by the window. Outside, the station was already gone, replaced by a blur of countryside that seemed both England and nowhere at all. The hum of the rails was steady, hypnotic. Across from him, a man in a dark overcoat leaned forward. "You ever wonder if what we took that night was more than money?" Bruce frowned. What else could it have been? The man only smiled, and for a moment Bruce thought he saw something glint in his eyes. Not gold, but starlight. "This train," the man said, "has been running a long time, longer than the railways, longer than men have kept time." Bruce glanced down the aisle toward the farthest carriage. Its door stood ajar, and beyond it was darkness, deep and endless. Something in his chest tightened. Not fear, not exactly, but the sense of a journey's true end. The conductor's voice rang softly through the carriage. "Next stop, the West." Bruce closed his eyes. When he opened them again, the train was sliding into a station made of light and shadow, a place without walls or tracks, where the air smelled faintly of rain on old iron. The gold he had stolen, the years he had lived in its shadow, none of it mattered here. The journey was over. The debts were paid. And somewhere in the waking world, the whistle blew once more, searching for the next name on its list.